Hey, everybody, and welcome to Flop the Podcast, a podcast by Treefish EDU.
This is the show that features teacher guests sharing their stories of educational mishaps or flops and what they learned along the way. Why do we do it?
I'll tell you why we do it, because teaching is tough, and we all flop from time to time. But by sharing these flops and success stories, we hope that you can benefit from their experiences.
I'm your host, Nick Johnson, alongside Marianna, Crandall. In this episode, called Teaching Lab-Based Science in a Remote or Hybrid Classroom, we will be sitting down with Marianna Crandall to talk about her experiences teaching physics in a remote and hybrid learning environment. As a science teacher myself, I'm really excited to talk to her about her experiences trying to teach a lab-based science course in a remote and hybrid classroom. We've been living this sort of crazy educational lifestyle for a while now, and I think that teaching science has challenges that we don't see in any other subject area. So I'm really pumped to see what Marianna has to say about this. So thanks for being here, and we'll kick it off just letting you tell us a little bit about sort of you as an educator and when you knew you wanted to do this and be part of the educational community. Now as a teacher, of course, this could include what you do now and how you got to this point in your career. So I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me.
Sure.
So a little bit about me. Both my parents are teachers, so I like to say it runs in the blood. My dad especially is a physics professor. So I would always go into his classroom and back to school night or bring your kid to school. So I kind of saw what it was like to teach physics. Honestly, the first time I saw physics was when they were doing Lagrangian or something like that, which was super overwhelming. So I was like, oh, this looks terrible. I'm never going to teach it. And then 4 years later, I'm like, oh, this is great. I love physics. So I kind of always fell in love with this idea of teaching other people and helping them with this idea. So I graduated from the College of New Jersey with physics and secondary education. And then I went back and actually got my master's in science education at Temple University. So I've been here for almost 3 years and at Hopewell, and I'm really excited.
That's awesome. And I think you mentioned to me that you're actually, did you say you're teaching a college course as well?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I actually taught a physics course at the College of New Jersey this past fall, which was online as well. So that was actually really cool because we utilized a lot of resources that we wouldn't normally have. So I'm not sure if you want me to continue talking about this or if you would like me to focus more on high school stuff.
Yeah, I mean, all of it's good. And actually, I was going to say, I hope that's something we can sort of tie in because, of course, and as our listeners know on Flop the Podcast, it's all about things that are valuable in the classroom that we used to be able to do, and now all of a sudden having to switch that over. So I definitely want you to. Well, I want to get to that stuff for sure. But first, let's start with those things that were valuable to us in the classroom. So some practices or some of the main things that you used to value very highly that sort of got screwed up by this whole remote classroom. And sure, that can totally include the college class. I think that's going to be actually pretty interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So some things about physics and science that always drew me in was this idea of being able to explain the world and being able to play with things. Everyone always says physics has the best toys, and it's kind of because we do. So being able to take apart a motor, being able to see how this circuit works and things like that. And that's not really something you can do in a remote classroom. So that's the hard part, is how can I get the kids engaged? How can I get them to explore? How can I get them to explain these questions and just really understand how does the world work? How can I apply it? And how can I get them thinking, critical thinking?
So a lot of that probably has to do with lab work, right? Because I know when, for me, and I love that you said explain the world, because that was always my kind of draw in with chemistry too. I was never great at chemistry. I took AP Chem in high school and I got a 2 on the exam. But I just thought it was so cool that you could explain why everything is the way it is in physics, even at a deeper level, a lot of times, and then chemistry can do so. So I think that's great. Obviously, I'm assuming that you have found your lab work has been hurt pretty significantly by the remote hybrid classroom as well, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I know that you probably feel the same way, and everyone I've talked to has really felt like, what are we going to do with labs now?
Right.
So not being able to have them use the equipment that they would normally do, or just not being able to touch and use that tactile learning is definitely a disadvantage, especially in science. Because we want them to explore, we want them to touch, we want them to say, if I spin this faster, what happens? And it's just not, there's not as much of a learning advantage to doing that online, unfortunately.
Right. Okay. So quick recap. We're trying to give kids this idea of, explaining the world. We're trying to get them that hands-on lab experience somehow via Zoom or via Google Meet or whatever your preferred platform is. How did you tackle this? What were some of the ways that you attempted to sort of bring these practices back into your classroom? And I know I'll mention too, Marianna, we teach at the same school. That's how I know her. And that's why I invited her on the show. I know she does lots of great stuff. We have a hybrid model. So I think this is going to be particularly interesting because you're in both worlds. You're in the hybrid world of half the kids are sitting in front of you. The other half are at home via Zoom. Super tough. But you also have, this fully Zoom experience of the TCNJ class too. I would love to sort of compare those and talk about all that stuff, but I'll let you take it from there. How did you bring some of this stuff or attempt to bring some of this stuff back into your class?
Yeah, so my emphasis this year in particular was trying to provide phenomenon that is interesting. So really relating it to the everyday world. I knew that they wouldn't be able to take apart things and be able to play with things, for lack of a better word, using their hands. But I thought if I could give them this draw, then they would be more interested and they would see how this simulation would interact. So one of my favorite labs that I always do is the Crumple Zone lab. So what I do is I give them a picture. It's actually a GIF of an old car and a new car, and it's crashed against the wall. And you can see that this new car will really crumple. It has airbags, and the person inside is okay. As opposed to the old BMW car, it crumples against the wall, and it's completely destroyed. The person inside, there is no airbags. So I asked the question, why? What can we observe? What questions can we ask? So they go through the lab, they ask the questions, and we look at this idea of how does momentum and impulse affect the safety features in our car. And by the end, we can talk about airbags. We can talk about why you bend your legs when you land. We can talk about this idea of why boxers roll with the punches. So really trying to emphasize this idea of how does the content and the simulations they're doing in class relate to the outside world. So I'm trying to shift emphasis here a little bit.
Okay. I love that. And I think that's really smart. Was there anything that didn't go so well? Because we're always trying to acknowledge that too on the podcast as you're pulling these things in. And I love that, the GIF idea of the crumpling car. It's a really smart way to do that. Certainly some things didn't go as planned, correct? As you were sort of on this journey of bringing these experiences to the kids.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a learning curve for everybody. And I first had to figure out, well, how do I modify the labs that I originally had? So what kind of platforms do I want to use? Do I want to use a Jamboard? Do I want to have them try and figure out how to put this information in the chat? So it was just a lot of technical things that kind of was working on, but also how do I get them to start thinking in a different way that they've previously been thinking? And I think that was probably the biggest challenge in the beginning, and kind of setting my expectations, telling them what I want and things like that. By the fifth, sixth one, they kind of got used to it. And it's relatively smooth sailing.
One thing I wanted to talk about, because I know a lot of science teachers are trying to use and are sometimes doing lab kits to send home to kids, or even just expecting students to use, materials that are in their houses already. Have you experienced anything with that or found things that didn't work or worked?
Yeah, so we did use lab kits, so we do have them. For some labs, I thought it worked really well. For simpler labs, labs that required more prep time and setup, I felt like it wasn't worth doing because they spent so much time setting it up that they weren't really analyzing the data. And they weren't really thinking about what they're doing, and they weren't thinking about error. And so if their answer didn't make sense, it didn't make sense. And it wasn't something that I could see why it didn't make sense because I couldn't exactly see the setup. So for simpler labs, we absolutely did do them. And there are some definite advantages of being able to observe what happens, see what happens. For some of those labs, I'll try and videotape it. So it's a little bit better than a simulation, but some of the lab kits worked really well. Some of them, not so much.
So what was the major complication with the ones that did not work? It's just too complex, not enough, expecting them to be able to do these things at home was the main issue, or I don't know, what was like the kind of the problem there?
So for instance, we do the bullseye lab every year, which is where we roll a marble down a ramp and then we have to predict where it'll land. So it's for projectile motion. So we do this, and there were just a lot of issues that were kind of coming up because some kids' tables were slanted, some kids weren't, some floors were level, some floors weren't. So it was just this, I couldn't troubleshoot for them as much as I normally would. So to kind of get around that, what we did is I still did do the lab, but what I had them do is I put them in groups. So I would kind of ask, what errors do you think could happen? And then they would talk about it and see if their values, their velocities kind of fell into this group of, oh, maybe it overshot because my table was slanted downwards. Maybe it was under because my floor was going the other way. So just really forcing them to think and critically think about, how does this make sense?
That's awesome. And you mentioned simulations in there. How big of a role did those play, and kind of what didn't work, and then what eventually did work when it came to using those effectively?
Yeah, so I use simulations a lot. I want to say that's probably the majority that we use. I occasionally use videos and things like that to do labs. Honestly, the physics community has been fantastic for that. Physics Aviary, all the programmers there have been fantastic. I've emailed them asking them to make adjustments and things like that. So I've been really thankful. Simulations work well to collect data, and I feel like that's what I've been using them for. Then I try and elaborate on that and apply it to real world scenarios. So in a typical year, we place a lot of emphasis on designing and planning experiments. This year, I've tried to shift a little bit more to analyzing data and evaluating data and relating it to other concepts.
I think that's important for other science teachers listening, is that sort of knowing it's okay to shift, right? Where you might really, and I know physics is super heavy on that aspect, is planning and experimenting and playing with things and seeing what works in that experimental design. But, you can do critical and analytical thinking other ways. It doesn't have to be that. And maybe this is just a time where you let that go, but then you shift the focus to other things. So that was really important, I think, for people to hear in this. I also kind of wanted to just get your opinion because, I'm a chemistry teacher, and this is like, my set of challenges is different in that a lot of this stuff the kids are using in lab, I literally can't send it home because it would be illegal and dangerous. and there's certain household chemicals that, maybe vinegar for the acetic acid, that they might have in their kitchen, but maybe not. And again, I just can't get these things to them. So one of the ways I tried to do lab, this is for the hybrid model, is I had the kids who were physically present in school doing the lab experiment with actual chemicals because it's in school and it was controlled. And they had, there's one kid per group that had their their Chromebook out. That's what our school has, is a Chromebook as a personal electronic device for the students. And they were in Zoom pointing the camera of the Chromebook at the lab that was taking place in school while the kids at home, so the remote students, were just watching. And it honestly, it felt kind of flat because at least for the kids in school got annoyed because it's a pain to always be doing this and kind of hold your
trying
camera.
to like angle it and everything.
Yeah, so it wasn't fun for them, and a lot of them just kind of stopped doing it because it was so annoying. And then the kids at home, obviously, they weren't getting that same experience. Was there a particular way that you dealt with the hybrid situation, or did you just stick to kind of that simulation model and other things so that it didn't matter where you were, home or in school, you were getting the same experience both ways?
So it's funny that you say that, because in the beginning, I feel like I tried to do that too. And so like I would like split up data and have like using the lab kits, like one kid would do one trial, another kid would do another trial, another kid would do another trial, and then they'd put all their data together. And I was like, this is going to be great. They're using their lab kits. Oh man, some of this data did not make sense at all. So it was moving faster when it should have been going slower. And I was like, okay.
So you'd say that probably didn't work out so well just because it was so all over the place and there's too many things coming in from too many different directions, I guess.
Exactly. Go ahead. Sorry.
That's okay. That was kind of my experience too. And again, it was the same thing. I still tried to do that, but I sort of shifted away and just focused on more things that I could control when it came to lab. And I do know there's actually some biology teachers who needed to get like household safe chemicals to their kids, and they would informally poll students and see who's got vinegar at home and who doesn't. And for the kids that didn't, they actually put kits together and like dropped it off at their houses. I never went that far, but that was always an option out there too. Okay, so that's a ton of great stuff. I want to talk a little. What did you
end up doing? How did you adjust your lab?
Yeah, I didn't. It went good. It went really well one time, where the kids I also had it set up so the kids at home could like ask questions through Zoom, and it sort of played aloud in the classroom, so I could answer questions from the kids at home. But it was just so clunky that I sort of just abandoned the model and went with things that it didn't really matter where you were, right? So like you mentioned the simulation, you're here, you're home, it makes no difference, right? And I did do it one other time, just on a smaller scale, where it was like here's one teeny tiny little like 5-minute experiment, kids in school, show your partner at home. So that wasn't like this. Because my mistake, I think, was a 45-minute lab where you had to be pointing the camera at what was happening the whole time. Bad idea. You can't do that. So shrink it down, make it a little bit more manageable.
Absolutely.
So that was my fix there. But it's like I said, it still wasn't.
I love that. I'm gonna have to try that, maybe for demos.
Demonstrations for sure. The college course that you teach, which is fully digital, are labs a component of that, or was there a particular way you dealt with that in this sort of Zoom classroom environment?
Yeah, it was actually a lot of fun. So I taught at the college in New Jersey. It's a course for general education majors. So it's essentially your liberal learning course. So it was a lab course that someone had to take. So what I typically did was I decided to flip the classroom. So that's what I usually do in high school. And I really wanted to emphasize that on college. So I would give them videos to watch. I would give them simulations to play with the day before. And in class was problems and labs. So I gave them, I had them analyze videos. I had them play with these simulations. And at the end of each lab, we would come back together and I would have Jamboards posted with questions. And I would break them up into groups and go through the different questions and talk about it. I think it worked pretty well. It allowed the kids to work at their own pace, but also collaboratively. So I got to know who was friends with who and who worked well with each other. So it gave them a lot of freedom, which I think that they appreciated. And I also did a lot of projects. That was the other side of things that I did with the college course. So our phone is fantastic. It has sensors. So we used so many sensors, so many apps that allow us to figure out force and time and acceleration and things like that. So I really wanted to leverage projects. So how can I build a shoe that is good for a runner? What happens when you text and drive? How far do you travel? How does this change when you're on ice?
So two things that I think are huge here. And one of them is, and this is actually the reason that I wanted to invite you on to this episode, is the whole flipped classroom thing. I knew that you were an advocate and a user of the flipped classroom model. And I'm particularly interested in how that works for lab, because for me, a flipped classroom, and for anybody that's listening that doesn't know, the kids as homework, essentially. It doesn't have to be done at home, but before they come to class, wherever that is, could be on the bus ride into school that morning, they watch a video, ideally a very brief video that instructs them on some sort of content and what's going to happen that day in class, so that you don't have to lecture to them, essentially. And I'm a huge fan. It works amazing for me in chemistry. Obviously, it works well for you in physics too. I've never considered it as a lab support, where the prep for their lab work is the video before. And it sounds like that's what you're doing and what you've tried. Am I understanding that correctly?
I have done that occasionally. I've done it a lot for content, like you said, of utilizing them learning the content prior to completing the lab. But I have made little snippets of videos of instructions of how we're going to go about doing the simulation and utilizing it. I used it a lot when we were doing the project. So I would create little videos of checkpoints of saying, at this point, you should have this done, or this is what this means. These are some frequently asked questions to kind of keep them on track. I think it's really great because it allows them to play it back. It allows them to kind of stop and think. And I don't know about you, but sometimes when people are talking to me, it goes in one ear, out the other. And I really wish I recorded that. So it's really nice when the instructions are recorded or I'm able to go back and things like that. So I wanted to try and utilize that for my students as well.
Yeah, I think it's cool, to sort of expand that thinking of the flipped classroom as what can be a lab support. If there's a particularly challenging component of their lab work or the analysis to follow, embedding a quick instructional video in your lab documents, which you can do if they're all digital, that sort of, helps kids along who need it. Or like you said, they can listen to it multiple times, or, after you've done this a few years, you pretty much know where they're going to get stuck. So you can build in those little kind of video supports along the way. I think that's awesome. And I'm glad we got to point it out. And then the last thing that I want to talk about that I think is great is, realizing that almost 100% of kids have a tool that is maxed out with scientifically accurate sensors. And that is the phone, right? I mean, you mentioned it. I want to talk a little bit about it too, because I think a lot of science teachers don't utilize it for what it can do. I don't know, like in the physics world, what do you have them use the phones for?
What can it do, honestly? Yeah. I use an app called FizzFox. I've used it more in college than in high school, just because of privacy settings and asking kids to download stuff. But really, it's fantastic. It allows you to create acceleration versus time graphs. I use GPS to get distance time graphs, velocity time graphs. It has a gyroscope, so you can get angular quantities. It's incredibly useful, especially for AP, where AP is such a lab-based course. So being able to, hey, stick your phone on a Lazy Susan. Let's go ahead and get a graph of the angular acceleration. What was the torque? It's a fantastic resource. And literally everyone has it. So it's not like they need to go out and buy it. So I definitely think moving forward, I hope to use more phone sensor stuff.
I know it's such a cool tool. And even I just want to mention, I mean, physics is, sort of the obvious one if you start thinking about the camera and the light that it has on there. I'm sure you could set up like a photo gate sensor kind of thing, right? Is that an option? Sure. So that's immediately obvious, but there's an app called I think it's Google Science Journal. Have you heard of that before? And if you're a bio or a chem teacher listening to this, they even have things where the phone's camera is on, and you can set like a test tube on top of the camera, and based on the amount of light that passes through the solution in the test tube, it can measure, the amount of light that the solution absorbs. So there's all kinds of really creative ways that, people are building phones as a measuring tool. And we used to spend literally thousands, tens of thousands of dollars on all these tools to measure things in class. And it's kind of turning out that the cell phone can do so much of that. And I think obviously in this kind of remote or hybrid environment, that's, extra important to realize. The last thing, Marianna, I want to get to is you mentioned the project. What was your favorite one, or the one that stuck out to you the most? So if I'm a science teacher listening, wow, that sounds really cool, I'm going to try and do something like that.
So I've done a couple bigger projects and a couple smaller projects, and I definitely think it depends on the level as well. So virtually bigger projects are hard. So my texting and driving project, this is the second year I've done it, which I love. I think it's really fantastic. It allows them to decide, it allows them to figure out how far will you travel when you text and drive. So how far do you travel when you react? How far do you travel when you are looking down at the text? How far do you travel when you actually brake? And then it allows them to look at different conditions like rain, snow, age, drunk driving, to figure out how far do you travel. And they create a public service announcement based on that. So that, I think, has kind of been my baby. Harder to do virtually than it was last year. So maybe my more successful virtual projects was my skydiving project, where I had them use a simulation to advertise for a skydiving company. So talk about what are the different forces, what does the velocity look like, what would you experience as you were skydiving? And that was shorter, like 2-3 days, as opposed to the texting and driving project encompasses like a unit and a half.
That's awesome. So many good tips in there, keeping them short, right? A project doesn't have to be some big, giant, drawn out thing. And probably in this teaching environment, shorter is better. I love a good PSA project. It's super fun, and the kids always like that too. So I'm glad you brought it up. And I think that probably wraps it up for this episode. Marianna, thank you so much. That was awesome. I know if I was a science teacher listening to this, I would have tons of new things to go check out and investigate. So thank you for joining us for an episode of FLoppED, the podcast. Thanks, as always, to our listeners for spending time with us today. We want to encourage you, if you're listening, to check out Treefish EDU online at treefishedu.com. You can also follow us on Twitter or YouTube at Treefish EDU. And if anybody has any questions for Marianna, you can reach out to us. Probably Twitter is the best way to do it, and we'll put you in touch. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to Flop the Podcast by Treefish EDU. Remember to check out our next episode on any platform for podcasts or on the Treefish EDU YouTube channel.
You can learn more about our virtual and in-person PD offerings at treefishedu.com.
And be sure to follow us on Twitter at TreefishEDU and sign up for our newsletter at treefishedu.com.